Hello and welcome to UATV. I am Alas Garjuk and you're watching Head to Head. A lot of criticism has been put on the Ukrainian parliament, which voted for a new commissioner for human rights. Recently, 273 votes were fateful for Lyudmyla Denysova. She was appointed to monitor observance of human rights in Ukraine during the next 5 years. Why there is much of controversy around her name? What are the key tasks for Ukrainian Ombudsman? And what is the situation with obeying human rights in Ukraine today? To answer these questions, we are joined in the studio by Tetyana Pechonchyk, Chair of the Board at Human Rights Information Center. Hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
So, Ms. Pechonchyk, there have been a lot of concerns from human rights activists about this election of Ombudsman in Ukraine, and they blame the process to be opaque. Why?
There were numerous violations of the procedure during this election, so we called our parliament and the head of Verkhovna Rada, Andriy Parubiy, to make procedure transparent. And actually we were campaigning for the competition, open and transparent competition for this position, as to our mind the whole process was deeply politicized, and we would like to have independent person with deep human rights knowledge on this position, but then we received totally opposite result.
Well, as far as I know, the Committee on Human Rights of the Ukrainian Parliament was also requesting to hold the procedure according to Paris principles. So what are these Paris principles, and what would be the proper way to select the ombudsman?
Paris principles, these are United Nations principles that regulate the national human rights institutions and ombudsman offices functioning in the world, and also they describe the principles how to be independent ombudsman. And I just can remind to our viewers that our ombudsman office has A status. This is the highest status in the world. That means that this is an independent institution from the government, and it can make independent assessments of human rights violations in Ukraine. So according to these principles, in order to select a new ombudsman, civil society and human rights defenders should participate and be involved into this process. But what we had here in Ukraine, all the process was not transparent, and the ombudsman position became a position for some political bargains, and we also were supported, as you mentioned, by the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, and Grigory Nemyria, he also made the statement that we need to reload this process, as it was very long, and it led to the result when, for example, ombudsman position was voted instead of voting for the head of the national bank, and this, you know, all
so
politics
this is the
around.
political bargaining that you're talking about?
Yes, yes.
Could you be more specific about it so our audience can understand?
Yeah, we received this ombudsman as a result of this political bargaining.
Between what parties?
Between Petro Poroshenko bloc and also People's Front, and so they gave their votes to each other to vote for this position for one candidate and
so
another.
So Ludmila Denisova is obtaining the position of ombudsman, and she's from People's Front, and then we could expect the head of the National Bank of Ukraine to be from Petro Poroshenko bloc party.
This was deal between them, and this was done not in transparent way. And also, law on the ombudsman elections in Ukraine says that the voting should be secret. But they voted openly, and they violated the procedure. And they did it because they wanted to control how many votes will come from each party. And so when we have the secret with voting with ballots, so it's more difficult to control for the political factions how their MPs are voting and behaving themselves. So we received this as violations of procedure. And I also would like to mention that even the term for voting for these candidates expelled in the beginning of June last year, because the law says that the voting should happen in 20 days term after these candidates candidates were submitted to the parliament, and this 20 days term expired
in June.
In June last year.
Because as far as I remember, Valeria Lutkovska, who used to be Ukrainian ombudsman, her service expired in April last year. So basically, 1 year ago, the new ombudsman was supposed to be selected already.
Yes, but
why did it take this long?
Because they didn't have maybe at that time enough votes or not enough, promises. And
or didn't they have the deal, basically?
Yes, there were no deal, let's say. And for me, the irony was that even Ludmila Denisova voted for herself twice. And this is also a conflict of interest when the person votes in this for herself.
How is that possible that she's taking part in the voting?
She had to withstand and do not participate in these elections, and also say to Verkhovna Rada about her conflict of interest. But she participated and she voted for herself.
Wow. Well, what do you personally think about Ludmila Denisova as new ombudsman in Ukraine?
This is for all civil society, for human rights defenders. This is a big challenge now because we had concerns how independent this person can be from political parties and from their influences, how competent this person is as a human rights defender, because one of the requirements for this position is a previous experience in protecting human rights. And we know that Lyudmyla Denysova was a minister of social policy, but this is not a human rights activity. So
she has never defended human rights, basically?
Basically, yes, but formally Committee on Human Rights allowed her to be the candidate on this position, and they said that for him, like, formally she is human rights defender, but we would like to have a human rights defender on this very important position, not only formally, but be real human rights defender. And strong candidates from civil society just couldn't participate in this because there were no open competitions. Everything was done somewhere under the curtains, where no space for civil society.
Discussed in the side talks.
Yes, and now we have a situation when, for example, the representatives basically from one political parties, they have the National Police and Ministry of Interior, they have Ministry of Justice and Penitentiary System, and Ombudsman who should be independent and who should give some critical assessment of what is happening in prisons or in police, with police brutality, is actually the member of this circle. So we have concerns, and this is also, I think, for new challenge for Lyudmyla Denisova to try to be independent in these circumstances.
Okay, you as a human rights defender, how does your information center cooperate with Ombudsman office?
We had quite a good cooperation throughout these last years. We are members of the National Preventive Mechanism. This is a system of independent visiting of closed institutions, custodial settings, prisons, internats, and many places where people are kept under the control of the state. So we visited many of these places, and as a monitor, I also visited with the colleagues from Ombudsman office many psychiatry institutions, internats for disabled people, and others. And also we cooperate in many other aspects, for example, in our anti-discrimination campaign. And also last year we did a very deep and profound research on the topic how Ukrainians understand human rights, and we received a lot of data. This is from opinion polls, and this data also were used by the previous ombudsman while she was working on her strategy for the next period of ombudsman office, and we really would like to see the new ombudsman also using this data while defining the priorities of her work.
If you're working with Ombudsman so closely, could you list some key priorities for Ombudsman in her work in nowadays Ukrainian reality?
I think this is very important to continue all the work that was done before, especially when it comes to the access to public information, to the protection of personal data and privacy rights, combating discrimination, and also working with internally displaced persons and helping to people who suffered because of the conflict in Donbass and Crimea. And also, of course, this is a national preventive mechanism and combating torture in Ukraine.
But what is the current situation on observance of human rights in Ukraine? What is the level of awareness, so to say?
We have, like in general, people have some knowledges about human rights, about the situation, but when we ask further questions and see deeper, we have that these are not appropriate knowledges that doesn't reflect the real picture very often. And I think it's very important when we have the human rights monitoring, which is done not only by NGOs, but also about the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission, and this is an independent assessment and barometer, basically, of what is happening in Ukraine with human rights.
But what do Ukrainians do nowadays to protect themselves from human rights violations? Where do they complain?
Well, we asked people what do they do if their rights are violated, and we discovered that 60% of populations, they even doesn't have any attempts to protect their rights. Only 40% of people who experience some violations on their own experience, they try to do something with that. And when it comes to the ways and instruments, on the first place, people put the media. They say in Ukraine there is no efficient institutions like police or prosecutor's office. The first thing to protect your rights is to go to journalists and to tell them about your story. And people hope that when journalists make their
bring the stories,
and yes, and then on the second place it's European Court on Human Rights, which is not the national court. Of course, it's far away, but people have very good impression of this. But when we asked people, this is about their imagination. But when we asked people whose rights were violated and who tried to do something to protect themselves, what they did on practice, so we saw in the first place they went to their relatives and to their neighbors, and they were looking for some contacts that would help them to solve their situations.
But in general, is the awareness rising, or is it on the low level?
This survey that I'm talking about was done the first time in the history of Ukraine, so we do not have the previous data to compare, but we'll make the second round of this survey in the end of this year, so we'll see the dynamics in 2 years.
Well, let's hope that more than 40% of Ukrainians will start defending themselves if their human rights are violated. But thank you so much for your work and for this interesting conversation.
Thank you.
That was Tetyana Pechonchyk, Chair of the Board at Human Rights Information Center. Thank you for watching UATV.